Hello there and welcome to a new video for Age of Wonders 4. This one is a unit guide for the Dark Culture. I'm going to analyze the entire roster here, talk about strengths and weaknesses, what you can do best with them, where they are weak and where they synergize well, and a general understanding of the identity behind this roster is what I'm trying to give you here. So let's get started with the first unit. Let's talk about scouts. The Dark Culture Scout is a very special scout. They are stealthy in forests, rocky terrain, and swamps, and they also see further. This is a grade A infiltration unit that you can easily sneak behind enemy lines, and if you are in war with somebody and if you have had the opportunity to hide somewhere here, you can totally pillage behind the enemy lines, and it's a really hard thing to get rid of if you have a couple of spies/scouts behind the enemy lines. You can wreak havoc with these just by riding around and destroying provinces. But there's also the synergy with the cavalries on the or the mounts of these guys. You can have different mounts as a cultural trait, and they are really cool as wolf mounts, which gives you a point blank AoE spell, which is pretty good for defensive measures. Spiders go well too because they give you a really powerful AoE ranged attack. But all in all, their main sales point is in the stealthy infiltration point, or stealthy scouts that just guard your own territory that are hard to spot. With the Dark Culture, you have easily eyes everywhere. So let's get over to the next one, the Archer. The Pursuer is a little bit of a standard unit, you could think, in the first place, but they have one really cool gimmick. They can weaken with ranged attacks. Weakening is really cool because this means you can reduce the enemy's damage pretty nicely just by attacking them. This comes as a very, very important trait for our melee units because they all get bonuses if they hit weakened attackers. It's also, well, sort of a utility trait that you will find on a lot of dark units. This is, though, pretty much all I have to say. They are a solid and reliable physical damage frame, cheap to build, easily enchantable, can be spammed out in masses, and is, your go-to unit for physical attack and spreading weakness easy in the early game. Your Dark Warrior is your tier 1 shock unit, and they are the real unique part about the early game of the Dark Culture because nobody else has access to shock units that early on. Shock units have two distinct traits that are really awesome about them. They deal their full damage with just one action point left, and they also break defense modes and remove retaliation attacks unless it's a spear unit. So that is your typical unit to get in there and burst a lot of damage into the enemy. You gotta pay attention to the fact that they are really vulnerable. Those defensive stats are really nothing to work well with. And it's, in my opinion, really important that you try to get as much Call of the Weak procs as possible, because it not only deals 20% damage more, it also applies regeneration to your dudes, and that makes them already a lot more resilient when you start using that. But still, they are very, very susceptible to burst damage because of their low defenses, but they are the first to get in and burst down a target as well. So combined with your archers, you have a pretty nice damage that you can put onto one unit, but your tier 1 roster lacks defensive options massively. You have a lot of damage, but you are, as long as you have only access to tier 1, you are a glass cannon at that point. Be aware of that. Tier 2 makes these things a little bit better. We have now access to the Night Guard, which is a wonderful frontliner. It is your best frontliner. Has a decent melee damage due to being tier 2, but comes also with the Call the Weak stat, so they can also gain regeneration. They are spear units, so they have a wonderful potential in retaliation attacks, also deal extra damage against large and cavalry. Really nice bonus. And they also come with a Dark Stalwart trait, which sunders enemy resistances by just standing next to them. That's a really, really massive trait, and that makes them to your best frontline unit that you got. These guys are basically what should remain in the front line after your Dark Warriors have burst down some targets. So altogether, try to get your Night Guards in the front slots as much as you can, and be wary about using your Dark Warriors too much in the front seat row after you have attained tier 2 units. The Warlock is your tier 2 battle mage, and it's one of the bread and butter skills units of the Dark culture. It's really worth mentioning, though, that this unit is much more on the utility side than other battle mage units, because they are spreading weakness like crazy, but they also are not that much on the high damage side. The Sundering Curse is a strong single target damage spell, very, very strong single target damage spell, but they don't apply any status effects that would deal more damage or anything. You are debuffing the enemy most of the time with that. The real strong part about the Warlock is that they can shred defensive off of a really, really high range. The Sundering Curse's range is really massive, and it always hits. There is no dodging, no accuracy. Therefore, enough Warlocks can burst down a target really, really easily, because if you have 5 Warlocks aiming at one target, that defense sundering becomes more and more of an issue, or you can just soften up your enemies with that. Altogether, Warlocks are really, really your bread and butter ranged unit. I think these are among the most precious parts of your ranged toolkit. The pursuers are more of a cheap filler at that point, and if you need physical damage, they are obviously a good choice. But due to the fact that shredding defenses is a really easily accessible thing for this faction, I personally value those Warlocks a lot, because they have so much more versatility compared to the Pursuer. But they are also costlier, and I'd highly recommend mixing these units nevertheless. So, we are at the tier 3, let's talk the Dark Knight. So, man, the Dark Knight unit is such a good unit. It is a massive single target burst with a heavy charge strike. It even negates the defensive options of a spear unit, but also do they feature the Dark Surge, which deals damage to enemies in a 2-hex cone, and it even doubles when the enemy is afflicted with negative status effects. Since applying negative status effects is basically the second nature of this faction, I mean, you even gain automatically access to Baneful Curse, which is exactly the ability to spread a negative status on a hex radius area. Oh boy, these guys are therefore really the most powerful thing in your roster. They have basically 2 big downsides. For one, they are quite costly, but also they are cavalry. That means they suffer from all the weaknesses cavalry has. They take more damage from spear units. Luckily, they do counter any form or remove any form of retaliation attack, which is really, really amazing. Also worth mentioning that they also sunder enemy defenses, so that's another thing worth stating out. And they also come with a Call the Weak trait. So if you opt into wolf mounts, your Dark Knights turn into something entirely else. They have a massive synergy with that racial trait, because wolf mounts give you a point-blank AoE that weakens enemies, but also that mount gives you a perk which makes your units basically stronger for standing right next to somebody who's also riding on a wolf. So this is a massive synergy. But one way or another, the Dark Knight is the unit that I personally think you should totally rush yourself towards to, because they are just a better Dark Warrior. They have everything you'd desire: high resilience, high mobility, single target, and AoE damage. So once you have access to Dark Knights sufficiently, well, the Dark Warrior's only advantage remains then that he's not riding a horse and he's not taking bonus damage from Cavalry Slayers, but beyond that, the Dark Knights totally outclass the Dark Warriors, in my humble opinion at least. So, where does that put the Dark Culture's roster in a nutshell? Well, they are amazing at burst strategies. they can totally focus onto one target and annihilate that in a blink of an eye. You have early access to shock units. The pursuers can do their part as well. If you position them well, they can deal also a lot of damage. And you have, together with the Dark Knights and the Warlocks, pretty high range even with your bursts with your burst damage. So altogether, if you want to let somebody die with this faction, you can do it really, really well. This comes though with a innate downside. You are really weak on the defensive side. You have basically no defensive unit whatsoever. You have, though, that's something I have to point out here, you do have a hidden support all the way down, though, with this faction by the Call the Weak trait. For one, it applies regeneration to your dudes, which means they constantly regenerate some of the damage, but also the whole weakness thing debuffs the enemy, which means the enemy will deal less damage to your units, which makes the regeneration even more powerful, which means that you are basically supporting by debuffing the enemy. But that also means that your faction synergizes massively by gaining access to support units from other factions. I highly recommend you to check out to get some supporters into your ranks. One support unit per banner is really all it takes to let your units just die way, way less. I feel like losing units is one of the things that I personally saw as the biggest weakness of the Dark faction, because it just happens so easily once the enemy has tier 3 and tier 4 units, because your entire roster is just so darn squishy. If somebody gets close to your Dark Warriors or Pursuers or Warlocks, they just melt. They have no real defenses. Well, the Warlocks are pretty decent against magic attacks, but that's where it ends. Only your Night Guards and your Dark Knights are somewhat resilient. The rest of your roster is just very, very vulnerable. Therefore, I value, as a second thing, shield units a lot. I personally saw a huge synergy with the Barbarian roster, because you gain access to stunning shield units and supporters. Alternatively, I think the Industrious make a pretty good fit as well, but so do the High faction. I think every faction that can give you some supporters are just amazing. So if you can conquer and integrate one of those one of those free cities that gives you access to the things that your roster is naturally lacking, you boost up your power by a lot. Because the dark culture, I personally see, is just massively good at constantly fighting. From tier 1 to tier 3, you should always wage war, because this is where you thrive best at, my personal opinion at that. So, I hope you found that video helpful. There's of course more to say. For example, I wanted to talk about one thing that I totally forgot, good for those who stayed. Dark Knights are also amazing on unicorns, because they can teleport over enemy lines. Convince me otherwise. And also, it's ridiculous to be evil and ride a unicorn at the same time. Now, leave me your comments down below about what combos you personally think are there, what kind of things I forgot to mention about these guys. A thumbs up would be wildly appreciated, as well as a subscription. There is a playlist link down there leading to more Age of Wonders info videos from my side. So if you haven't seen other videos from me, that's the playlist links to go to. I did already quite a few things there. A big thanks at the end of this video to the supporters of this channel. You guys are truly amazing. I appreciate all the stuff you do. And if you want to find out more, there's Patreon, PayPal, and Buy Me a Coffee as ways and means to check it out. If not, well, I really don't mind either. I'm grateful that you're still hanging out here, listening to me, watching this video, and I hope you'll have a great day now. Bye-bye.